The morning sun streamed through the tall glass windows of San Francisco's Grand Convention Center, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Alexander Sterling adjusted his navy blue tie, a habit he'd developed over years of attending high-profile events. At 38, he'd built Sterling Innovations from a garage startup into a tech empire worth billions. Yet today, something felt different in the air. The annual Tech Innovation Summit was in full swing, with crowds of entrepreneurs and investors filling the massive hall. Alexander moved through the space, nodding at familiar faces and shaking hands with business partners. His personal assistant, Jenny, walked 2 steps behind him, rapidly taking notes on her tablet about potential deals and meetings. "Mr. Sterling, the panel discussion on AI development starts in 20 minutes, Jenny reminded him, but Alexander's attention had suddenly shifted elsewhere. Through the sea of dark suits and formal attire, he caught a glimpse of honey-blonde hair that made his heart skip a beat. It couldn't be her, he thought, not after 5 years. But it was. Claire Matthews stood near the refreshment table, looking even more beautiful than he remembered. She wore a simple cream-colored dress that spoke of elegant professionalism, her hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Alexander's feet moved before his brain could process what he was doing. Then he saw them, 4 little boys, all identical, playing some sort of quiet hand game while sitting in a row of chairs near Claire. Each child wore neat blue shirts and khaki pants, their dark hair neatly combed. But it was their faces that made Alexander freeze mid-step. He knew those faces. He saw a smaller version of his own features reflected 4 times over. The boys looked about 5 years old. His mind raced, calculating dates and times. 5 years ago, right before the divorce. Claire. The name left his lips barely above a whisper, but she heard him. She always had a way of sensing his presence. She turned, and for a moment, the bustling conference center faded away. Her green eyes widened with recognition, then fear, followed quickly by resignation. She'd known this day would come eventually. "Hello, Alexander," she said softly, but a voice carrying the same gentle tone he remembered from their happier days. "I suppose we have some catching up to do." One of the boys looked up at the sound of their conversation. "Mommy, who's that man?" he asked, his steel-gray eyes. Alexander's eyes filled with curiosity. Claire took a deep breath, her hands clasping together in that nervous gesture Alexander knew so well. "Boys," she said, turning to all 4 children. This is someone very important Mommy used to know." The children all turned to look at him now, their identical faces showing different expressions: curiosity, shyness, interest, and something that looked remarkably like recognition. Alexander felt his world tilting on its axis. There, he couldn't finish the sentence. "Yes," Claire answered the unspoken question. "They're yours." "Ours. I found out a few weeks after the divorce was finalized." Alexander's legs felt weak. He grabbed the back of a nearby chair for support. Jenny, sensing the gravity of the moment, quietly stepped away to give them privacy. "All 4 of them?" he managed to ask, his eyes moving from one small face to another, noting his own features mixed with Claire's in perfect harmony. "Meet James, Lucas, Oliver, and Thomas," Claire said, pointing to each boy in turn. "There'll be 5 next month." The boy she'd identified as James stood up, straightening his little shoulders in a gesture so similar to Alexander's own mannerisms that it took his breath away. "Are you the man from Mommy's pictures?" James asked boldly. Alexander looked at Claire questioningly. She blushed slightly. "They've seen our wedding photos," she explained. I didn't want them to grow up not knowing anything about their father." The other 3 boys had gathered around their brother now, their curious eyes studying Alexander's face. Little Thomas, the last one Claire had introduced, tilted his head in a considering way. "He looks like us," he announced to his brothers, causing them to giggle. Alexander felt tears pricking at his eyes, something that hadn't happened since the day Claire had walked out of his life. 5 years of believing he'd lost his only chance of family, and here stood not just Claire, but 4 beautiful boys who carried his blood. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked Claire, his voice rough with emotion. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "You were so angry back then, convinced I was after your money. When I found out about the pregnancy, I couldn't bear to have you think I was trying to trap you. So I decided to do it on my own. Maybe it was wrong, but at the time, it felt like the only choice. The convention center buzzed with activity around them, but they stood in their own bubble of life-changing revelation. Alexander looked at his sons, who were now whispering among themselves and stealing glances at him. The panel discussion, Mr. Sterling. Jenny's voice came from somewhere behind him, reminding him of his obligations. Alexander straightened up, making a decision that would change multiple lives. "Cancel it," he said firmly. "Cancel everything for the rest of the day." He turned back to Claire and the boys. "I think we have a lot to talk about." Claire nodded slowly, a mix of relief and apprehension crossing her face. "Yes," she agreed. "I think we do." The boys looked excited at this unexpected turn of events, their small faces lighting up with the prospect of adventure. Alexander felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. He had a family. A beautiful, unexpected, perfect family. And this time, he wouldn't let them slip away. The private dining room at the Street Regency Hotel offered a peaceful escape from the convention center's chaos. Alexander watched in amazement as his 4 sons devoured their chocolate chip pancakes, their small faces showing identical expressions of delight. The breakfast meeting seemed like the safest option, neutral ground where they could talk while keeping the boys occupied. "They all have your appetite," Claire said softly, a slight smile playing on her lips as she stirred her coffee, "especially Lucas. He can eat twice his weight in pancakes." Lucas, hearing his name, looked up with syrup dripping down his chin. "These are the best pancakes ever," he announced, making everyone laugh and breaking some of the tension in the room. Alexander couldn't stop staring at them. These 4 perfect little beings who'd been living in the world for 5 years without his knowledge. Each boy had his own way of eating. James cut his pancakes into precise squares, Oliver created artistic patterns with the syrup, Thomas shared his berries with his brothers, and Lucas dug in with enthusiastic abandon. "Tell me everything," Alexander said, turning to Claire. "From the beginning." Claire set down her coffee cup, her hands slightly shaking. "I found out about the pregnancy 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized. I was feeling sick at work, thought it was just stress from everything." She paused, lost in the memory. "When the doctor told me I was carrying quadruplets, I nearly fainted. You went through that alone." Alexander's voice cracked with emotion. "Not entirely alone. My sister Emmy helped me through the pregnancy. I had to stop working at 4 months, doctor's orders. That's when I started writing children's books from home." Claire's green eyes sparkled with pride. "The books did well enough that I could start my own publishing company, Sunshine Stories. The boys were my inspiration." Oliver perked up at the mention of the books. "Mommy writes the best stories. I draw pictures for them sometimes." Alexander felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over him. "I've missed so much," he whispered. "Tell us about when we were babies," James commanded, showing that natural leadership that seemed to come so easily to him. Claire smiled, reaching out to wipe some syrup from Thomas's cheek. "Well, you boys certainly knew how to keep me busy. Lucas figured out how to climb out of his crib first, and within a day, all of you were doing it. I had to convert your nursery to toddler beds when you were only 18 months old." The boys giggled, clearly having heard this story before. Alexander leaned forward, drinking in every detail. "James was always watching out for his brothers," Claire continued. "Even before they could walk, if one of them cried, he would crawl over to check on them. Oliver started drawing on everything as soon as he could hold a crayon: walls, furniture, his brothers. Only when they were sleeping." Oliver defended himself, causing another round of laughter. "And Thomas," Claire's voice softened, "he was our little peacemaker from the start. Whenever 2 of them would fight over a toy, he'd bring them each a different toy to distract them." Alexander watched as Thomas smiled shyly at this description, leaning against his mother's arm. The gesture was so sweet, so natural, it made his heart ache for all the moments he'd missed. "What about me?" Lucas asked eagerly. "What was I like?" "You, my little inventor, were always trying to figure out how things worked. You took apart your baby monitor when you were 2. Claire shook her head at the memory. "Just like your father used to do with everything electronic in our house." The mention of their shared past brought a heavy silence to the table. The boys, sensing the change in atmosphere, became unusually quiet. "I looked for you, you know," Claire said quietly, "when they were about 6 months old. I came to your office building, but your secretary said you were in Japan for 2 months, working on some big merger. I thought it was a sign that I should stick to my original decision. Alexander remembered that trip, the lonely nights in Tokyo hotel rooms, drowning himself in work to forget the pain of losing Claire. I threw myself into expanding the company after you left. Told myself it was what I wanted, but seeing you today, seeing our boys, he trailed off, overwhelmed. Daddy. Thomas's small voice broke through the emotional moment. It was the first time any of them had called him that, and Alexander felt tears threatening again. Are you sad? No, buddy, Alexander managed to say, reaching out to touch his son's hand. I'm just really happy to meet you all, and a little sad that I didn't get to see you grow up so far. We're still growing, Lucas announced proudly. I grew 2 whole inches last month. 2 centimeters, Claire corrected gently. We're working on the difference between inches and centimeters. 2 centimeters, Claire corrected gently. We're working on the difference between inches and centimeters. Well, I want to know everything about those 2 centimeters and every other moment I've missed, Alexander said firmly. He looked at Claire, his eyes pleading. I know I messed up before. I was so focused on building the company, on proving myself, I lost sight of what really mattered. But please, give me a chance to be part of their lives now. Claire looked at their sons, 4 pairs of eyes that matched Alexander's, looking back at her with hope and curiosity. We'll need to take this slowly, she said carefully. For their sake. Does this mean we get to see you again? James asked Alexander directly, showing that same straightforward approach that had served his father so well in business. Alexander looked at Claire, waiting for her subtle nod before answering. Yes, if that's okay with you boys. I'd really like to get to know each of you. Can you teach me about computers? Lucas asked excitedly. Will you look at my drawings? Oliver chimed in. Do you know how to play baseball? Thomas added quietly. Can we see where you work? James finished. Alexander felt his heart might burst with joy and regret and love, so many emotions he could barely contain them. Yes to all of that, he promised. We had a lot of time to make up for. As the boys returned to their now cold pancakes, chattering excitedly among themselves, Alexander caught Claire's eye across the table. There was still hurt there, still uncertainty, but also something else. A glimmer of hope, perhaps, that something good could come from this unexpected reunion. The morning sun streamed through the hotel's windows, casting a warm glow over this newly discovered family. It wasn't going to be simple, Alexander knew, but nothing truly worthwhile ever was. He had a second chance he never expected, and this time he would get his priorities right. The early morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Alexander's home office as he stared at the papers spread across his desk. Legal documents, custody agreements, and visitation rights proposals covered every inch of the polished mahogany surface. His lawyer's words from their meeting yesterday still echoed in his head. You have every right to demand equal custody, Mr. Sterling. The court will likely favor you given your resources. But something about all this felt wrong. The thought of dragging Claire and the boys through a bitter court battle made his stomach turn. Still, he couldn't bear the thought of missing another moment of his sons' lives. His phone buzzed with a text from Claire. The boys won't stop talking about yesterday's visit to your office. Lucas hasn't taken off the junior programmer badge you gave him. A smile tugged at his lips as he remembered Lucas's wide-eyed amazement at the robotics lab. All 4 boys had visited his company headquarters yesterday, their excited chatter filling the usually serious corridors with life. James had sat in his office chair, pretending to take business calls. Oliver had covered his whiteboard with surprisingly good drawings of the office view. Thomas had charmed every employee they met with his gentle questions about their work. The doorbell rang, pulling Alexander from his thoughts. Jenny, his assistant, showed Claire in. She looked tired, clutching a manila envelope. I got the papers from your lawyer, she said without preamble, her voice tight. Full joint custody? Really, Alexander? He stood up, running a hand through his hair. Claire, I've missed 5 years. 5 birthdays, first words, first steps. I can't miss anymore. And you think the best way to be in their lives is to start with legal threats. Her green eyes flashed with anger and hurt. Do you have any idea what this will do to them? I'm not threatening anything, Alexander protested. I just want. What you want? Claire cut him off. What about what they need? They've barely known you 2 weeks, and you're already talking about splitting their time between homes. Alexander's phone chimed again, this time with photos Claire had sent earlier of the boys at their school art fair. Oliver proudly holding up his painting. Lucas and his science project. James giving a presentation. Tom is helping a classmate with their display. Look at these, Claire said softly, noticing what he was looking at. Look at their lives, Alexander. The stability they have. The routines they depend on. And you want to disrupt all of that because you feel cheated? Her words hit home. Alexander sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. I do feel cheated, he admitted. But not by you. By myself. By my own stupid pride 5 years ago. If I hadn't been so caught up in my own importance. We both made mistakes, Claire said, her voice gentler now. She sat in the chair across from him. I should have told you about the pregnancy. I was just so hurt, so convinced you thought the worst of me. A knock at the door interrupted them. Jenny poked her head in. Mr. Sterling, the board meeting starts in 20 minutes. Cancel it, Alexander and Claire said simultaneously, then looked at each other in surprise before sharing a small laugh. The boys have a school play next week, Claire said after a moment. They're doing The 3 Little Pigs. Well, modified for 4 Little Pigs. They'd love for you to come. I wouldn't miss it, Alexander said immediately. Then, looking at the legal papers on his desk, he made a decision. He gathered them all up and dropped them in the shredder. The whirring sound filled the room as years of legal expertise turned to confetti. Claire watched him with wide eyes. What are you doing? Starting over, he said simply. No lawyers, no custody battles. We figure this out together at a pace that's good for the boys. I don't want to be the kind of father who puts his own needs before his children's. The tension in Claire's shoulders visibly relaxed. They have soccer practice on Thursdays, she offered. And Sunday afternoons are usually when we go to the park. You could join us if you want. I'd like that, Alexander smiled. Then he remembered something. Oh, and Claire? About the media. She groaned. I saw the headlines this morning. Tech billionaire's secret family revealed. The school's already getting calls from reporters. I've hired extra security for your house and the boys' school, Alexander assured her. And I've got my PR team working on a statement that should take some of the pressure off. No one gets near our boys. The way he said our boys made Claire's expression soften. You know, Lucas asked me last night if you could teach him how to build a robot. Really? Alexander's face lit up. Mum. And Oliver wants to show you his entire art portfolio. James has written a business plan for a lemonade stand. He's definitely your son. And Thomas, he just wants to know if you'll read him bedtime stories sometimes. Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion. I want all of that. Every messy, complicated, wonderful bit of it. Then let's do this right, Claire said, standing up. Not as enemies, not through lawyers, but as parents who both want what's best for their children. Partners. Alexander held out his hand. Claire looked at it for a moment before taking it. Partners. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. The boys' bedtime is at 8:30. They like when you do different voices for the characters in the stories. And Alexander, thank you for choosing them over your pride this time. After she left, Alexander looked at the family photo she'd sent him, all 4 boys covered in ice cream at their last birthday party, grinning identical grins at the camera. He set it as his phone's background, replacing the stock photo that had been there for years. His phone buzzed with another message from Claire. Lucas says to remind you that you promised to show him how computers work. His words. The whole thing, Daddy, not just the easy parts. Alexander laughed out loud, already mentally rearranging his weekend schedule. Board meetings could wait. He had some computer lessons to plan for a very determined 5-year-old, and 3 other amazing little boys to get to know. The morning sun had risen fully now, streaming through his office windows and making the city below sparkle. It was a new day, in more ways than one, and Alexander Sterling had finally figured out what really mattered. The weekend couldn't come fast enough for Alexander. He'd spent hours preparing his home for his first full day with all 4 boys. The usually pristine penthouse now had child safety locks on cabinets, colorful beanbags in the living room, and a mini science lab set up in the spare room, complete with safety goggles sized for 5-year-olds. "Daddy, look what I made." Lucas's excited voice echoed through the apartment. He'd held up a contraption made from old computer parts and cardboard boxes. Alexander had been teaching him basic electronics, and Lucas soaked up knowledge like a tiny sponge. "That's amazing, buddy. Want to tell me how it works?" Alexander sat cross-legged on the floor, his expensive suit collecting dust as Lucas launched into a detailed explanation of his robot helper. Meanwhile, Oliver had claimed a corner of the living room, spreading his art supplies across the floor. His tongue stuck out slightly as he concentrated on his drawing. "It's all of us," he explained when Alexander peeked over. "See? That's you being tall, and Mommy with her pretty smile, and all of us brothers holding hands." Alexander's heart swelled as he looked at the Crayon family portrait. "Can I keep this one for my office?" Oliver beamed, adding extra stars around the figures. "I'll make you one every week." From the kitchen came the sound of James's voice, surprisingly authoritative for a 5-year-old. "No, Thomas, we have to count the blueberries equally. It's good business practice." Alexander found his oldest and youngest sons carefully dividing blueberries for the pancakes they were making with the help of his housekeeper, Mrs. Chen. James had insisted on learning about breakfast business, as he called it. "Look, Daddy," Thomas said shyly, holding up a perfectly arranged plate. I made a smiley face with the fruit. "That looks delicious," Alexander praised, helping Thomas carry the plate to the dining table. He'd learned that Thomas, though quietest of the four, noticed everything. Just yesterday, Thomas had remembered exactly how Alexander liked his coffee after seeing him make it once. The morning flowed into afternoon, each moment revealing new facets of his sons' personalities. James organized a family meeting, his term, to plan the day's activities. Lucas disappeared into the mini-lab every chance he got. Oliver covered any blank surface he could find with artwork. Thomas made sure everyone got equal turns choosing games. "Daddy," Lucas tapped at his sleeve during lunch, "can you show me how to make a real robot next time?" "First, you need to learn about safety and basic circuits," Alexander explained, remembering his own childhood experiments. "But yes, we'll work on it together." "I want to learn too," James announced. "We could start a robot company." "What about an art robot?" Oliver suggested, not looking up from his drawing. Thomas quietly added, "Could we make a helper robot for Mommy? She works really hard." Alexander felt a familiar pang at Thomas's words. Claire did work hard, raising 4 boys alone while building her publishing company. He'd seen the dark circles under her eyes, even though she tried to hide them. "How about we all work on something special for Mommy?" he suggested. The boys' faces lit up at the idea. The afternoon turned into a secret project session. James handled project management with admirable seriousness. Lucas worked on a simple mechanical flower that could open and close. Oliver designed the decoration, and Thomas wrote a sweet message that made Alexander's eyes misty. As they worked, Alexander learned more about their daily lives with Claire. How she never missed a school event, even if it meant working late into the night. How she made up different voices for each character in their bedtime stories. How she kept their favorite cookies in her office for surprise visits. "Mommy says you used to make things too," Lucas said while carefully connecting wires under Alexander's supervision. "I did. That's how I started my company, building things in my garage." "Did you have a helper like Mommy helps us?" Thomas asked. Alexander's hands stilled. "No, buddy. I thought I could do everything alone. That was a big mistake." "That's silly," James declared. "Everyone needs helpers. That's good business." Out of the mounts of babes, Alexander thought, smiling at his son's wisdom. The sun was setting when Claire came to pick them up. She found them all on the floor of the living room, surrounded by art supplies, robot parts, and the remains of their cooking adventures. "Mommy," 4 voices chorused. "We made you something." Claire's eyes widened as they presented their creation, a decorated box that opened to reveal the mechanical flower, accompanied by drawings and a heartfelt note. "The flower moves because of gears," Lucas explained proudly. "I made it pretty," Oliver added. "I wrote the card," Thomas said softly. "And I supervised production," James stated importantly. "It's perfect," Claire whispered, hugging each boy tightly. Her eyes met Alexander's over their heads, sharing a moment of pure parental joy. As they were leaving, Thomas hung back. "Daddy," he said seriously, "can we do this again? All of us together?" Alexander knelt down to his level. "As often as you want, buddy. This is your home too now." After they left, Alexander walked through his now quiet apartment. Crayon masterpieces decorated his fridge. A half-finished robot sat in the mini lab. James's carefully written schedule was still on the coffee table. Thomas's perfectly arranged fruit plate design had been photographed and saved. His phone buzzed with a message from Claire. "They haven't stopped talking about today. Thank you for making it special." Alexander looked at the family drawing Oliver had made, now framed on his desk. 5 years ago, he'd filled his life with meetings and mergers, thinking success meant having the biggest company, the most money. Now he knew better. Success was in the smile of a shy little boy, the excitement of a budding inventor, the creativity of a young artist, and the determination of a tiny business mind. He had a lot of time to make up for, but looking at the happy faces in Oliver's drawing, Alexander knew he was finally getting his priorities right. His calendar for next weekend was already blocked off. No meetings, no calls, just 4 amazing little boys, and all the time in the world to know them better. The call came at 2 a.m., jolting Alexander awake. Claire's voice trembled on the other end of the line. "Lucas won't stop burning up. We're heading to the emergency room." Alexander was already pulling on his clothes before she finished speaking. "I'm on my way." "Which hospital?" "Children's Memorial. The other boys are with my sister, but Lucas kept asking for you." Claire's voice broke. 20 minutes later, Alexander rushed through the hospital doors to find Claire pacing the emergency room waiting area, her face pale with worry. She'd clearly left home in a hurry, wearing mismatched shoes and one of the boys' small jackets thrown over her pajamas. "How is he?" Alexander asked, his heart pounding. "They took him back 10 minutes ago. His fever hit 104, and he was so confused." Claire wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the warm hospital air. Without thinking, Alexander pulled off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. It was such a familiar gesture. He'd done it countless times during their marriage when Claire got cold during evening walks. A doctor appeared, clipboard in hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling?" Neither corrected her. "How's our son?" they asked in unison. "Lucas has a severe case of pneumonia. We're starting him on antibiotics, but we'd like to keep him for observation. His fever's quite high, and his oxygen levels are lower than we'd like." The world seemed to tilt under Alexander's feet. Lucas, his brilliant, curious little boy, who just yesterday had been explaining his latest invention idea. "Can't we see him?" Claire's voice was barely a whisper. The doctor nodded, leading them through sterile corridors to a pediatric room. Lucas looked tiny in the hospital bed, connected to monitors that beeped steadily. His usually energetic face was flushed with fever, his dark hair damp against his forehead. "Daddy?" Lucas's eyes fluttered open. "Did you bring your tablet? You promised to show me more robot designs." Alexander felt tears prick his eyes as he moved to his son's bedside. "Hey, buddy. The robots can wait until you're feeling better, okay?" Claire sat on Lucas's other side, gently stroking his hair. "Try to rest, sweetheart. Daddy and I are both here." Lucas drifted off to sleep, his small hand clutching Alexander's larger one. Hours passed in the quiet hospital room, broken only by the steady beeping of monitors and occasional visits from nurses. "I should call Emmy, check on the other boys," Claire said softly, standing up. She swayed slightly, exhaustion evident in every movement. "Hey." Alexander caught her arm, steadying her. "When's the last time you ate anything?" Claire blinked, thinking, "Yesterday? Maybe lunch?" "I'll get us some coffee and something to eat. You call Emmy." When Alexander returned with sandwiches and coffee, he found Claire crying quietly by the window. "The boys are scared," she said when she sensed his presence. "They've never been separated like this. Thomas wouldn't stop crying, and James is trying to be brave, but Emmy says he's barely holding it together, and Oliver." "Go to them," Alexander said immediately. "I'll stay with Lucas. The boys need their mom right now." Claire shook her head. "I can't leave him." "Claire, look at me." Alexander set down the food and turned her gently to face him. "You're not leaving him alone. I'm here. I'm his father. Let me be that for all of them. Let me be here for Lucas while you comfort our other boys." Fresh tears spilled down Claire's cheeks. "I've been doing it alone for so long," she whispered. "Sometimes I forget I don't have to anymore." "You don't? Not ever again." Alexander squeezed her shoulders gently. "Go. I'll call you if anything changes, and you can come back in the morning with the boys before school." Claire hesitated, then leaned down to kiss Lucas's forehead. "I love you, baby," she whispered to their sleeping son. At the door, she turned back. "Alexander? Thank you." After she left, Alexander settled into the chair beside Lucas's bed, one hand holding his son's small fingers, the other pulling up his tablet. He spent the quiet hours of the night researching pneumonia in children, making notes about recovery times and best practices. Around dawn, Lucas stirred. "Daddy, you stayed?" "Of course I did, buddy. How are you feeling?" "My chest hurts," Lucas admitted. "Where's Mommy?" "She went to check on your brothers. They were worried about you. She'll be back soon with them." Lucas was quiet for a moment, then asked in a small voice, "Will you tell me a story? Like Mommy does?" Alexander set aside his tablet. "What kind of story would you like?" "Tell me about when you and Mommy met. Was it at your big company?" Alexander smiled, remembering. "Actually, it was at a tiny coffee shop. I was working on my first computer prototype, and your mom was writing her first children's book. I spilled coffee all over her manuscript." He told the story softly, watching Lucas's eyes grow heavy again. Just as his son was drifting off, Lucas murmured, "Daddy?" "I think Mommy still has the coffee-stained book. She keeps it in her special box with the pictures of you." Alexander felt his heart squeeze. Before he could respond, he heard familiar voices in the hallway. Claire was back with 3 very worried little boys in tow. James immediately took charge, climbing carefully onto Lucas's bed to inspect all the machines. Oliver pulled out his crayons, determined to brighten up the room with drawings. Thomas simply curled up in the chair next to his twin, holding his hand. Claire looked better. She'd changed clothes and clearly gotten at least a little rest. Her eyes met Alexander's over their children's heads, sharing a look of understanding. They'd gotten through their first crisis as parents together, and somehow they were stronger for it. "Mommy?" Lucas's voice was sleepy but stronger. "Daddy told me about the coffee shop. He said he was trying to invent something." "He was," Claire smiled, sitting on the edge of the bed. "And he did. Your daddy has always been good at fixing things." "Not everything," Alexander said quietly, looking at her. "Some things took me longer to figure out." The morning sun peeked through the hospital blinds, casting a warm glow over the family gathered around the bed. Lucas's fever had finally broken, and the doctor was pleased with his progress. It wasn't the way any of them had planned to spend the night, but somehow, in this sterile hospital room, they'd found something they'd lost: trust, understanding, and the reminder that some bonds never really break. 3 weeks after Lucas's hospital stay, life had fallen into a new rhythm. Alexander had converted the entire top floor of his office building into a family space, complete with a playroom, study area, and a cozy reading nook that Thomas particularly loved. The sound of children's laughter now regularly echoed through the once serious corporate halls. "Daddy, is this code right?" Lucas called from his special desk in Alexander's office. He'd recovered fully from his pneumonia, but still tired easily, so Alexander kept him close by during their afternoon visits. The small computer station beside Alexander's desk had become Lucas's favorite spot. "Let me see, buddy." Alexander rolled his chair over to check his son's work. Lucas had been learning basic programming, his natural curiosity making him a quick study. "Almost perfect. Just remember what we said about closing your loops." "Oh, right." Lucas's fingers flew over the keyboard, making the correction. "Can we show Mommy when she comes?" "Of course." Alexander checked his watch. Claire would be arriving soon with the other boys after their art class. These afternoon sessions had become their new normal, a way to blend work, family, and co-parenting that somehow worked better than any formal arrangement could have. Right on cue, the elevator dinged, and 3 excited voices filled the reception area. Oliver burst in first, clutching his art portfolio. "Daddy, look what I painted today." Alexander and Lucas moved to the comfortable seating area where Oliver proudly displayed his artwork, a series of watercolor paintings showing their family in different settings. One showed all of them at the park, another at home reading stories, and a third at Alexander's office. "This is amazing work, Oliver," Alexander praised, noting how his son had captured each family member's characteristics, right down to the way Thomas always held onto Claire's hand and how James stood tall like a little businessman. James was next, pulling out his notebook. "I wrote a business plan for our summer lemonade stand," he announced importantly. "We need to discuss the budget." "Later, James," Claire said gently, helping Thomas arrange his books on the reading room shelf. "Remember what we talked about? Family time first, business later." Alexander caught her eye, sharing a smile. They'd both been working on helping James balance his natural leadership tendencies with just being a kid. "How about we all take a break?" Alexander suggested. "I heard there's a new ice cream place in the park." "Ice cream before dinner?" Claire raised an eyebrow, but her eyes twinkled. What happened to the strict schedule? "Sometimes the best moments aren't scheduled," Alexander replied, remembering how their rigid routines had contributed to their past problems. "Besides, I have it on good authority that ice cream helps with business planning." "It does?" James asked seriously. "Oh yes," Claire played along. "Very important for brainstorming." The park was peaceful in the late afternoon light. They found a quiet spot near the pond, away from the curious eyes that still followed the famous family. The boys ran ahead to the ice cream cart, with Claire following to help with their selections. Alexander watched them, his heart full. Lucas, still slightly pale but getting stronger every day, carefully counting his change. James organizing everyone's orders efficiently. Oliver studying the colors of each flavor with artistic interest. Thomas making sure everyone got exactly what they wanted before choosing his own. "Penny for your thoughts." Claire sat beside him on the bench, handing him a cone. "Just thinking about how much I've almost missed," he admitted. "All these little moments, who they're becoming." Claire was quiet for a moment, watching the boys compare ice cream flavors. "You know, during those 5 years, I used to imagine telling you about them. Every first word, first step, first everything. I'd play out in my head how you'd react." "Tell me now," Alexander said softly. "I want to know everything." So she did. As the sun set over the park, Claire shared stories of their early years. How Lucas had said, "Why?" before he could say "Mama." How James had organized their toys by size when he was 2. How Oliver's first drawing had been on her favorite cookbook. How Thomas had learned to walk by following his brothers everywhere. The boys played nearby, their ice cream long finished, occasionally running back to add details to their mother's stories or climb into Alexander's lap for a quick hug. "Remember when Thomas got stuck in the laundry basket?" James called out, making his brother blush. "Or when Lucas took apart the TV remote?" Oliver added. "What about when James tried to sell our vegetables to the neighbors?" Lucas giggled. "And when Oliver painted the cat green?" Thomas spoke up, rare excitement in his voice. Each story wove another thread in the tapestry of their family history, moments Alexander had missed but could now share through their memories. As the evening cooled, Claire checked her watch. "We should head home. It's almost dinner time. Can't we stay longer?" Oliver pleaded, in the middle of drawing the sunset. Actually, Alexander cleared his throat, suddenly nervous. "I was hoping you'd all come to my place for dinner. I've been practicing that pasta recipe the boys like." Claire hesitated. It would be the first time she'd been to his home since their divorce, apart from picking up the boys. "Please, Mummy." Thomas's soft request decided it. Alexander's penthouse had changed since Claire had last seen it. Gone was the stark, modern furniture, replaced by comfortable pieces that could withstand enthusiastic 5-year-olds. Children's artwork decorated the walls, and a family photo wall was growing near the kitchen. The boys immediately scattered to their favorite spots, Lucas to his mini lab, Oliver to his art corner, James to his office space, and Thomas to the reading nook. In the kitchen, Claire watched Alexander navigate around his newly child-proofed space. "You've changed things," she observed. "Everything," he agreed, not just talking about the apartment. "I needed to." As they worked together preparing dinner, moving around each other with familiar ease, Alexander realized something had shifted. The awkwardness that had lingered since their reunion was fading, replaced by something more comfortable, not quite what they had before, but maybe something better. The sound of their son's laughter filled the apartment, punctuated by the occasional crash of toys or excited shout about a new discovery. It wasn't perfect. James and Lucas still argued over the robot kit, Oliver's art supplies still ended up everywhere, and Thomas still needed coaxing to join in sometimes. But it was real. It was family. And watching Claire showed the boys how to properly twirl spaghetti on their forks, Alexander knew he'd finally found what real success felt like. The morning of the boys' 6th birthday dawned bright and clear. Alexander stood in his kitchen, surrounded by balloon bouquets and carefully wrapped presents, each tagged with the right name in the right favorite color. The past few months had taught him so much about his sons, like how James preferred blue wrapping paper, Lucas got excited by anything in bright red, Oliver loved green, and Thomas's eyes lit up at the sight of yellow. "The cake delivery is on its way," Jenny reported, checking her tablet. After years of managing billion-dollar deals, his assistant had smoothly transitioned to helping coordinate children's birthday parties. "And the Science Museum is all set for the private tour this afternoon." Alexander nodded, adjusting the happy birthday banner for the 10th time. Everything had to be perfect. This was his first birthday with his sons, and he wanted to make it special. The elevator dinged and Claire walked in, carrying a box of decorations. "The boys are with Amy getting ready," she said, setting down her load. "Though good luck getting Lucas to wear his nice shoes. He's convinced his light-up sneakers are more scientific." They worked together setting up the decorations, moving around each other with an ease that came from months of co-parenting. The penthouse slowly transformed into a wonderland of science experiments, art stations, and games, each area carefully designed to match one of the boys' interests. "Remember our first apartment?" Claire asked suddenly, hanging streamers. "How we could barely afford birthday candles, let alone all this?" Alexander paused, remembering. "That tiny one-bedroom where the sink always leaked, but you still made it feel like home." "We were happy there," Claire said softly. "We were." Alexander met her eyes. "Claire, I've been thinking." The elevator chimed again, and excited voices filled the hallway. "They're here," Claire whispered, quickly finishing the streamers. 4 identical boys burst into the room, stopping short at the sight of the decorated space. Their Aunt Amy followed, smiling at their amazement. "Happy birthday!" Alexander and Claire called together. Each boy reacted in his own way. James immediately started inspecting everything with a critical eye, probably calculating the party's budget in his head. Lucas made a beeline for the science station, where simple experiments were set up. Oliver gasped at the art corner filled with new supplies. Thomas hung back, taking it all in with a gentle smile. "Is this all for us?" Thomas asked quietly. "All for you, buddy." Alexander knelt down to his level. "You and your brothers." The morning flew by in a whirlwind of activities. Lucas successfully created a mini volcano eruption, covering himself and half the science station in foam. Oliver painted portraits of everyone at the party, including Jenny and the cake delivery person. James organized a surprisingly efficient game of musical chairs, while Thomas made sure everyone got equal turns. After lunch, they headed to the Science Museum. Alexander had arranged for interactive exhibits that would interest each boy, robotics for Lucas, a color theory display for Oliver, a business and technology section for James, and a quiet area with fascinating facts for Thomas. "Daddy, look," Lucas called, pointing at a display about electricity. "It's like what we've been learning." "Can we build this at home?" James asked, studying a mechanical display with intense concentration. "I want to paint like this," Oliver announced, staring at a kaleidoscope exhibit. Thomas tugged on Claire's hand. "Mommy, did you know butterflies can see colors we can't?" Claire smiled, sharing a look with Alexander. "No, sweetie, I didn't. Tell me more." As the afternoon wound down, they returned to the penthouse for cake and presents. The boys sat around the table, their faces glowing in the light of 6 candles on each of their individual cakes. Chocolate for James, strawberry for Lucas, vanilla with rainbow sprinkles for Oliver, and lemon for Thomas. The morning of the boys' 6th birthday dawned bright and clear. Alexander stood in his kitchen, surrounded by balloon bouquets and carefully wrapped presents, each tagged with the right name in the right favorite color. The past few months had taught him so much about his sons, like how James preferred blue wrapping paper, Lucas got excited by anything in bright red, Oliver loved green, and Thomas's eyes lit up at the sight of yellow. "The cake delivery is on its way," Jenny reported, checking her tablet. After years of managing billion-dollar deals, his assistant had smoothly transitioned to helping coordinate children's birthday parties. "And the Science Museum is all set for the private tour this afternoon." Alexander nodded, adjusting the happy birthday banner for the 10th time. Everything had to be perfect. This was his first birthday with his sons, and he wanted to make it special. The elevator dinged, and Claire walked in, carrying a box of decorations. "The boys are with Amy getting ready," she said, setting down her load. "Though good luck getting Lucas to wear his nice shoes. He's convinced his light-up sneakers are more scientific." They worked together, setting up the decorations, moving around each other with an ease that came from months of co-parenting. The penthouse slowly transformed into a wonderland of science experiments, art stations, and games, each area carefully designed to match one of the boys' interests. "Remember our first apartment?" Claire asked suddenly, hanging streamers. "How we could barely afford birthday candles, let alone all this." Alexander paused, remembering. That tiny one-bedroom where the sink always leaked, but you still made it feel like home. "We were happy there," Claire said softly. "We were." Alexander met her eyes. "Claire, I've been thinking." The elevator chimed again, and excited voices filled the hallway. "They're here," Claire whispered, quickly finishing the streamers. 4 identical boys burst into the room, stopping short at the sight of the decorated space. Their Aunt Amy followed, smiling at their amazement. "Happy birthday." Alexander and Claire called together. Each boy reacted in his own way. James immediately started inspecting everything with a critical eye, probably calculating the party's budget in his head. Lucas made a beeline for the science station, where simple experiments were set up. Oliver gasped at the art corner filled with new supplies. Thomas hung back, taking it all in with a gentle smile. "Is this all for us?" Thomas asked quietly. "All for you, buddy." Alexander knelt down to his level. "You and your brothers." The morning flew by in a whirlwind of activities. Lucas successfully created a mini volcano eruption, covering himself and half the science station in foam. Oliver painted portraits of everyone at the party, including Jenny and the cake delivery person. James organized a surprisingly efficient game of musical chairs, while Thomas made sure everyone got equal turns. After lunch, they headed to the Science Museum. Alexander had arranged for interactive exhibits that would interest each boy: robotics for Lucas, a color theory display for Oliver, a business and technology section for James, and a quiet area with fascinating facts for Thomas. "Daddy, look," Lucas called, pointing at a display about electricity. "It's like what we've been learning." "Can we build this at home?" James asked, studying a mechanical display with intense concentration. "I want to paint like this," Oliver announced, staring at a kaleidoscope exhibit. Thomas tugged on Claire's hand. "Mommy, did you know butterflies can see colors we can't?" Claire smiled, sharing a look with Alexander. "No, sweetie, I didn't. Tell me more." As the afternoon wound down, they returned to the penthouse for cake and presents. The boys sat around the table, their faces glowing in the light of 6 candles on each of their individual cakes: chocolate for James, strawberry for Lucas, vanilla with rainbow sprinkles for Oliver, and lemon for Thomas. "Make a wish," Claire encouraged. Alexander watched his sons close their eyes, thinking hard about their wishes. In that moment, seeing all 4 of them together with Claire beside them, he knew exactly what his own wish would be. After cake came presents. Each boy received gifts tailored to their interests: a junior business set for James, a beginner's robotics kit for Lucas, professional art supplies for Oliver, and a collection of science books for Thomas. But it was Alexander's final gift that brought tears to Claire's eyes. "This is for all of us," he said, handing over a large wrapped package. Inside was a beautiful photo album, professionally bound. The first page showed a photo of Claire and Alexander from their wedding day. The next pages had ultrasound pictures Claire had saved, followed by baby photos of the boys. Then came more recent pictures: their first meeting at the convention center, days at the office, Lucas in the hospital with everyone around him, park visits, and family dinners. I had Jenny track down as many photos as we could find, Alexander explained, to fill in the gaps I missed. There's empty pages at the end, Thomas noticed. That's because our story isn't over yet, Alexander said, gathering his courage. He turned to Claire. If you'll let me, I'd like to help fill those pages. Not just as co-parents, but as a family again. I know I have a lot to make up for. Daddy, Lucas interrupted. Is this like when my robot wasn't working, and you said sometimes we have to try again with new coding? Alexander laughed softly. Something like that, buddy. Well, James said seriously, from a business perspective, our family functions better with both parental units in the same location. I could draw us all together, Oliver offered, already reaching for his crayons. Thomas simply walked over and took both his parents' hands in his small ones. Claire looked at their sons, then back at Alexander. We're not the same people we were 5 years ago, she said carefully. No, we're not, Alexander agreed. We're better. At least I'm trying to be. Claire was quiet for a moment, then smiled. The boys do function better with both parental units in the same location. Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep in a pile of wrapping paper and new toys, Alexander and Claire stood on the balcony looking at the city lights. You know this won't be easy, Claire said. We have 4 very strong-minded children and a lot of history. I know, Alexander took her hand. But I also know that the biggest mistake I ever made was letting you walk away once. I won't do it again. Inside, Lucas mumbled something about robots in his sleep, making them both laugh softly. James had a notebook clutched to his chest, probably full of party expense calculations. Oliver had fallen asleep mid-drawing, and Thomas was curled up with one of his new books. They look just like you when they sleep, Claire whispered. But they have your heart, Alexander replied. All 5 of us do. The night was warm, the city was quiet, and in that moment, everything felt possible. Sometimes life's biggest surprises came disguised as its biggest challenges. And sometimes, Alexander thought as Claire leaned against his shoulder, those challenges turned out to be the best things that could ever happen to you.